So I guess I'll just like start by saying that I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. And like I've been following your work for a very long time. And as a Black woman in like the climate movement, it's very hard to be heard in a lot of spaces. And I feel very inspired by your work. So thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today. I think it'll be really, really great. So yeah, I think we could just like start if you'd be able to like tell me a little bit about like your work and like all the work that you've done with Black Lives Matter and other organizations and stuff.
Sure. I think it's important that I just start by naming that the first work that I ever came into when it was in relationship to social justice work was climate change. For the first 6 years of my organizing work, I was focused on really challenging the auto industry in Los Angeles, the city that I live in and where auto is king, really pushing for the reducing of greenhouse gases, um, um, learning about the science of the tailpipe and how toxic it is, and then teaching it to the community that I grew up in, mostly Black people and Brown people. And so my foundation is climate change and environmental justice work. And as I grew and into my own politicization, much of my work started to be centered around policing and over-policing and over-incarceration and mass incarceration in my community. So before I ever started Black Lives Matter, I actually started an organization called Dignity and Power Now, a local grassroots org that focuses specifically on a local grassroots organization that focuses specifically on issues around incarceration and the Sheriff's Department. And then after that, 1 year later, Alicia, Opal, and I started Black Lives Matter. And when we started Black Lives Matter, we really were starting it as like an online community to kind of discuss the issues of racism and anti-Black racism in our communities. But we really quickly realized that Black Lives Matter was not just about an online community, that it needed to be something that we massified for the globe, and that it was something that people can use in their everyday organizing work, a part of our protests. And so you'll see the early protests that there's a bunch of Black Lives Matter signs with a hashtag, because we believed that the organizing wasn't just about being online and digital, but also being in the streets and showing up and challenging elected officials. The last set of work that I've done in the last several years has been very local focused here in Los Angeles County. I just passed a ballot measure called Reform LA Jails. And that ballot measure is going to do two things. Yay! It's going to make sure that the Sheriff's Department is accountable for issues of abuse. But it's also going to really call for a feasibility study so that we can decarcerate our overcrowded jails. So that's the work that I'm doing, spans from a very beginning of climate change work to now, which is very focused on mass incarceration, over policing. And last thing I'll say about this, which is, it's not a common conversation, but the creations of jails and prisons is a huge environmental issue. And we really should be thinking about, you know, the development of jails and prisons and the kind of the footprint that it leaves as a really toxic footprint. And so that feels really important to me to name in this conversation.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you would say that. With 0 Hours work, it's really important that we, you know, address social issues as well. And in our Getting to the Roots of Climate Change presentation, we talk about mass incarceration and how it is sort of like modern day slavery almost, where prisoners are being like, they have to work for like cents an hour and fight like natural disasters and make towels or, you know, do whatever. So yeah, that's like really cool. So I guess we could talk about like sort of like our Blackness and femininity. As a feminist, I think it's like really important for like women to be leading a climate movement or, you know, any movement in general, especially Black women. And it's really awesome for me to be working with so many Black women in my organization. So how does your Blackness and femininity inform your approach to this work as a whole?
Sure. I mean, I think I always have seen my Blackness as a form um, of really bringing people together and And I think as a feminist, also making sure that all of our movements have a deeply intersectional analysis. That is really critical to me. I think when we started all of our organizations and movements as women of color, and as Black women specifically, we realized that Black women are also often doing the labor but not receiving any credit, and oftentimes their labor was they were doing the labor, but their work was stolen. And so I think it's super critical that we lift up Black women leadership, because the reality is that Black women have always been the architects of movements. I mean, that's just true from across the board. And but they never get the praise for the work that they did or the labor that they implemented in the movement. So for me, much of my work is recognizing who is at the forefront and why they're doing that work, and making sure we are lifting them up. But also, I think Black women have a particular way that we do the work. It's a work that it's a way in which we are really interested in the whole. We're really interested in building out a community versus building an empire. And I think when we often see the way patriarchy works, especially on men, men are interested in building out their selves in an empire, and women are interested in building out community and freedom. And that's a generalization for sure. You know, I think there's some women that can be patriarchs, and there's some men that can be feminists. But the way we're socialized is very different. Women are socialized to take care of everybody, and men are socialized to take care of themselves. And then perhaps other people will be taken care of as well. And so I think as we're developing our movements, you see the difference in the quality of how our movements are being shaped. And I think that matters.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here real quickly. I want to ask, just in terms of like women and Black women, especially not getting like the credit or not being recognized, outside of just like the racial implications, do you think the socialization is like the expectation that we do that, and that's part of why we don't get that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that fem labor is disposable labor. It's a labor that is not to be praised. It's a labor that's to be seen as, quote, natural. Why would you praise something that someone does naturally? You breathe naturally, so why would you praise breath? So people assume that Black women in particular, what we do naturally is nurture. That's not true. We're actually socialized to be that way. And this type of socialization is often a violent socialization to be that way, right? It's not an encouraging it's not about encouragement. It's about forcing us to be a particular way, to serve a particular vision that's often not our vision. And so, yeah, I absolutely think that many of the reasons why we don't get praise is because why would you praise us if that's what we're supposed to be doing?
Right, yeah. And like, when we talk about like the root causes of climate change, we talk about racism, colonialism, capitalism, and the patriarchy. And a lot of people have problems with like when we say like the patriarchy, they're like, how could the patriarchy be one of the root causes of climate change? But it's 100% goes into that mindset of like building an empire instead of building a community, you know, like doing things for yourself and like feeding into that capitalistic mindset of like everything is a resource instead of like being able to build something up from the ground as a community. So yeah, I totally agree. So what do you think are like some primary factors that can cause society to believe Black people don't care about climate change? I'm so sorry, that was my mom.
Okay.
I had someone walk in my door talking. My mom came through that door. We're sheltering in place. This is what it looks like. Yes. Welcome to our homes. Can you ask that question one more time?
Yeah. So I was just like wondering, like in climate change, a lot of people of color definitely think that like it doesn't apply to like social issues. So like, what do you think is a primary factor that causes society to believe that Black people don't care about climate change in the first place?
Well, society thinks that Black people don't care about a lot of things. They think we don't care about ourselves. Let's talk about the concept of Black on Black crime. They don't think we care about our health. This is a classic, this is what we call gaslighting at the sort of macro level. It's telling a people that because of their poverty, because of their health conditions, because of racism, it's our fault. And so what you're hearing, so this myth that Black people don't care about climate change, we don't care about our communities is a lie. We are always the first ones to show up for ourselves. We're also often the last ones to show up for ourselves. And we're also often the only ones to show up for ourselves. And so what I would challenge people when they say that Black people don't care about climate change, I would challenge people around their ideas of what Black people are doing in the world and how Black people are relating. I also, I often hear that from white people mostly when they're in their own white bubbles, when they're like, why aren't there any Black people here talking about this issue? When in fact, there's probably a whole other meeting happening with a bunch of Black people trying to figure out how to take care of themselves. And just because Black people aren't in the mostly white meeting, it's probably because it's a mostly white meeting. And so I often hear that claim from people that aren't Black people. I hear that claim from people who've internalized an idea of what care looks like and how Black people care about things. And so I think it's always important to challenge and push people when they start to make generalizations of what Black people care about and what we don't care about.
So I'll just ask the question just to talk about the intersectionality of social justice and climate justice and why you think it's true that climate justice is a social justice issue and where that narrative and perspective comes into play in the POC communities.
Sure. It was either 2001 or 2002, maybe even 2003, that I went to the second annual People of Color Summit on Environmental Justice. And I remember going to that summit and meeting people from around the country, including Hawaii and Alaska, mostly all POC communities, from Black folks to brown folks to Native folks to Asian folks. And actually it was a global conference. It wasn't just because we had translation and everything. So it was people from around the world, and it was mostly folks of color, and we were all talking about the issues of environmental racism on our communities and the impact environmental racism had on our communities. And we were differentiating ourselves from the quote environmentalists who often are thinking about environmental justice from a very specific perspective, which is we have to save the whales, we have to save the tigers, we have to save the dolphins, which is incredibly important. We do have to save that part of our ecosystem. But it was also often mostly groups of white people who didn't actually care about saving the health and wellness of Black people and brown people. And so this conference was one of the first places where I got to see other people who look like me that were fighting for the environment and that were really interested and looking at the intersections of how building a jail and prison in a community was actually impacting that community's health and wellness, or talking about fracking in a inner city neighborhood, or talking about living next to a huge, oil refinery, and how those places are usually placed in poor neighborhoods that have people who are mostly people of color. And I think when we're talking about climate change and this current iteration of this really beautiful moment where climate change is being popularized, we have to be mindful of who's being seen as the leaders of this movement, because the reality is there's always been folks of color and Black women at the lead of these movements, because that we're the first people to get asthma, we're the first people to have severe allergies, we're the first people to get cancer because of these places in our neighborhoods, and we're also the last people to be talked about in these spaces. So when people are showing up for environmental justice rally or a climate change rally, look at who's around. be mindful of who you're talking about, how you're talking about it, and make sure that the conversation isn't just about one type of issue, but that it's about all the issues and how they intersect, because it's so incredibly important. We can look at Flint for that. We can look at Detroit for that. We can look at so many different communities who are impacted right now because of environmental racism. And if we don't name it as such, we could end up seeing an entire movement only talking about this issue in one way.
Yeah, and I had like the pleasure of being able to talk to some Detroit organizers in the past couple of months, and being able to like hear all the work that they've been doing for so long, and going up to Flint and talking with the people there has been like so eye-opening for me as an organizer. And I was able to just like learn so much from them. So yeah, it was definitely really cool. And that's like sort of why it's so cool to like see how Earth Day 50 is so different from like Earth Day 1, with like the evolution of like what fighting for the climate means, like not fighting for like the trees and the bees and the birds, but like also fighting for the people and like people of color, and like talking about environmental racism and the intersectionalities. So it's really cool to like see how that has changed over the years.
I love that. I think, yeah, and I think you know, the community who's done it best is the Indigenous community in this country. They're the first, I would say, fighters of environmental justice, and have seen the most devastating impacts that colonialism and capitalism and patriarchy has had on the land that they inhabited, and that was taken from them, and then they were sequestered off into, you know, many of them into reservations. And I think it's really important, as we are, you know, talking about environmental justice, environmental racism, and climate change, that we're talking about Indigenous communities who were probably the first warners, you know, the first people to warn us that if we continue on this route, what will happen to our places of our sacred land. They see this land as sacred. And as someone who was able to be at, you know, in Dakota at the No DAPL protests and spend a lot of time there, there's something really powerful about reminding ourselves about the original people of this land, and the work that they've done to try to steer the ship in the right direction, even with our national governments not caring.
Well, thank you so much, and we're gonna have to wrap it up there. But yeah, do you want to say any last things, Khristen?
I guess just like thank you so much for talking with me today. It was like really, really fun, and I've learned so much already, even in these last like 10 minutes. And I really hope to like connect with you in the future. So thanks.
Yes, and Khristen, how old are you?
I'm 18.
Okay,
18.
well, thank you so much for being the next generation of leadership. I'm really excited to see what you do for the rest of your time in our movement. Really, really powerful work. And thank you for taking the time. And thank you, Kim.
Yeah, just before we go, do you have any last advice for two young Black girls out here, doing the work and mixing things up? Do you have any last advice for us?
Sure. I think, you know, the work is always here. So make sure that you center your health and wellness. Make sure you're doing things, drink lots of water in this moment. If you have a therapist, make sure you see the therapist. Rely on your community right now. You'll always have this work. There's always going to be issues that we have to deal with, but we need your health. And that's sometimes the last thing that women, especially Black women, think about. So really want to remind the both of you and everybody else out there to center your health, because the only way we could do the work is to have you in it.
Wow. Thanks, Patrisse.
You're welcome.
I know you have so much to do today. We're going to let you go. Again, thanks for taking the time. Happy Earth Day.
Thank you. Happy Earth Day.
We'll talk soon.
Okay, talk soon. Bye.